Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Nicaliker. I'm the Humanitarian Policy Advisor with TROCRA. TROCRA is responding to the needs of internally displaced people in Syria, refugees in Lebanon, as well as providing assistance for our Caritas partners in Serbia, Macedonia and Greece. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a contextual journey rather than firing numbers at you, but to look at what's happening within Syria and then within the context of humanitarian crisis around the world. So I'm going to cover four messages in this presentation. Protracted conflicts force people to find refuge elsewhere. People uproot and move when there are no other options. While there are a few newer conflicts, the length of conflict is increasing, resulting in people being displaced for up to 17 years and sometimes longer. The Security Council and Member States must do more to prevent and resolve crises. And the collective response of Europe to supporting refugees in Europe will damage the reputation of the EU and the EU institutions. The EU's ability to advocate on a global scale for equality and human rights is being challenged by the EU itself. So, excuse me, very recently, President Higgins said that displacement is the greatest human rights issue affecting the world at this time. And as every day passes, this holds true. For the majority of people, displacement is an enormous loss of freedom, rights, and community. Education is disrupted or halted completely. People lose their families, their jobs, assets ranging from livestock to houses, businesses to cars, and their savings. Of the 59.2 million people displaced today, 38 million are displaced internally within national borders in some of the world's most fragile states. Lebanon, Turkey, and Pakistan each host over 1 million refugees. The EU is among the world's wealthiest regions in the world and has the capacity to develop policies that grant safe and legal access to Europe. And that's the point to emphasize, is there is the capacity to address these issues. Europe is choosing not to. Very recently, again, just to highlight the level of concern among humanitarian actors, Ban Ki-moon and Peter Maurer from the ICRC gave a joint press conference on the 31st of October, where they said, and you can read the quote, "In armed conflicts from Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, civilians are being killed and wounded in violation of the basic rules of international humanitarian law and with total impunity." And I think when you have Ban Ki-moon and the ICRC standing up together to make that statement, and this was pre-Paris, it just highlights exactly how the urgency for coherent, rights-based responses to crises around the world. So, 59.2 million displaced, of whom 19.5 million are refugees. Outside of conflict, 26.4 million people have been displaced from their homes by disasters brought on by natural hazards. Ahead of COP21, it's useful for us to remember that this is the equivalent of one person being displaced every second. And this is phenomenal, the impact that conflict and natural disasters are having on people's lives around the world. 1 in every 22 people is now either a refugee, internally displaced, or seeking asylum. 42,000 people leave their homes every day as a consequence of war. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre of the Refugee Council captures these figures, and today the likelihood of being displaced by a disaster is 60% higher than it was 40 years ago. Protracted conflicts force people to find refuge elsewhere. People uproot and move when there are no other options, and it's that simple. And I think when we look at some of the rhetoric and the reporting in Europe and some of the really irresponsible language from earlier in the year to describe refugees, this is what needs to be remembered. People don't put their children at risk. They don't pack up and go unless they have no other options. So while there are fewer conflicts across the world, the length of conflict is increasing. And I think this is a really important point, resulting in people being displaced for up to 17 years. UNOCHA in their report of 2015 have said that protracted is the new normal. So if you look at this graph from 2008, there were 63 active conflicts with 56,000 fatalities. And in 2014, we have 42 active conflicts with 180,000 fatalities. The numbers reflect the extremely violent fighting in Syria and Iraq, deaths in Afghanistan, which increased following the withdrawal of Western combat troops. Israel-Palestine conflict killed 2,500 people last year, mainly civilians, while fighting in Libya, Yemen and Central African Republic also contributed to the rise in overall deaths. Conflict drives displacement. It's not anything that people don't know, but regardless of economics and climate change or any other reason, conflicts destroys lives, not just for the short term, but for generations. And again, we can list so many conflicts where this is a fact, that there's the generational impact. And we see that in Ireland as well, the impact of protracted war and how it changes people's lives and how difficult it is to help people to rebuild and help people recover. Civil wars are getting longer, which means they're more protracted, as I said, but it means that people are displaced for longer. So it means that people can't rebuild their lives. Earlier on, we talked about the ability to find a job and to be employed. And for many people, having been in employment for most of their lives, to be faced with not just long-term unemployment, because not being able to use the capacity to work to support your family, being completely dependent on humanitarian assistance in a camp setting, not being able to see an end to a conflict, not being able to see a future. And that's what it looks like when there are no options and the only option is you lose what's left of your you use what's left of your savings and you get on a boat and you take your chances. So when we look at displacement and the scale of crisis, so I just wanted to capture a couple of examples from what is now the last century. And Rwanda, and many people will be familiar with this picture of 250,000 people who crossed into Tanzania in 24 hours, which was the largest and fastest refugee exodus in modern times. When we look at conflicts getting longer and more protracted, what is interesting is that within 3 months after the genocide, 2.1 million refugees were in neighbouring countries in 35 camps. Within 3 years, by the end of 1997, the vast majority of refugees had returned. Within 3 years. Bosnia, 3 million people fled their homes at the height of the crisis. 700,000 became refugees in Europe, and 2.3 million internally displaced within the old federation. 200,000 people were killed in Bosnia. $5.1 billion of international reconstruction support between 1996 and 1999 helped to rebuild the country. So people had options to return once the conflict was once the conflict ended. And Somalia, I think interesting for me, having worked in Somalia for a long time, the conversation we had previously reminded me a lot of the challenges, the different views and opinions of different groups that has kept Somalia in conflict for 21 years. Somalia has 70% of the population is under 30, most of whom have grown up in active conflict. And nobody wants that for Syria, but this is what protracted conflict looks like. 975,000 refugees in Kenya. Europe is unable to cope with the idea of 800,000 people coming to Europe over 2015. Kenya supports 975,000 Somali refugees. So the Security Council and member states are failing to prevent and resolve crisis. Political will is necessary to prevent conflicts and address the protracted nature of many of the world's conflicts. In 2000, the Brahimi report highlighted the failure of the UN and the need for institutional change. That was 15 years ago. The challenge of conflict management and the failure to support the responsibility to protect initiative due to vetoes are some of the major criticisms of the current structure of the Security Council. I don't think we can emphasize enough the importance of political will. Humanitarian assistance is not a conflict management tool, it's not a migration management tool. Humanitarian assistance should only be to support people during a period of crisis. Humanitarian assistance shouldn't be used to support people for up to 17 or 20 years because no one has been able to find a solution to allow people to live a life of dignity, being able to support their families and see a future for themselves. I'm going to have to hurry up. Yeah. So I won't spend any time on this. I just thought it's interesting, you know, for when humanitarian aid agencies, when we look at all the different crises around the world and what we deal with, and Syria fits in there. And yes, it is off the scale in terms of the numbers of displaced, but I thought it was interesting just to show a snapshot of the numbers of people inside Syria in need of assistance. 4.2 million, Afghanistan 7.4 million, Iraq 8.2 million. A number of European countries are claiming that Afghanistan is a safe country for return when it has 2.6 million refugees in other countries. I will speed on. Civil wars lasting from 7 to 12 years, as I said. The estimated cost of rebuilding Syria in its current state is around $200 billion. And an estimate that it will take up to 30 years to recover. So if you're a family and you're faced with this as your future, there have to be other options for people. There has to be open doors to support people. Again, we talked a little bit earlier on around where people are, and this map is just a good example of where Syrian people are finding some form of refuge, and 7.6 million are internally displaced within the country. And I think this is 4 million outside, but 7.6 million are essentially dependent on whatever assistance they could find, internally displaced inside the country, many in parts of Syria that are labelled as hard to reach by humanitarian aid agencies. So people are really dependent on whatever they can get on a daily basis. Trogra works with a number of national organisations within Syria who are able to provide very basic assistance, but on a sustained, continuous level. So where are people coming to? I've got 1 minute left. Where are people coming from moving into Europe? Again, just a snapshot from Eritrea, Syria, Nigeria, Pakistan, Kosovo, Afghanistan. And I don't have time to dwell, but I can share some of these if people are interested in them later. Asylum claims into Europe in 2015, again, in terms of scale, in terms of the movement of people, in terms of deciding there's no options left. We have to move, we have to leave, we have to go somewhere else. 715,000 asylum claims in Europe. Not all from Syria, but a large majority from Syria. In 2014, the entire EU approved 184,000. That's a huge leap, but also not a surprise given what was happening in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. Back to political will and inaction and being reactive rather than being committed to finding sustainable solutions for people. Again, I won't spend too much time on this, but in terms of where people are moving to, and you'll see Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq taking large numbers of people in the surrounding countries. And again, it's relative and it's proportional in what Europe should be able to do and should be able to support people in a far more respectful, dignified way. So what constitutes a crisis? 800,000 people in a population of 50 million or 500 million shouldn't be a crisis. But Europe is choosing for it to be a crisis. The real crisis exists for those who seek safety, but who are confronted by brutality, smugglers, traffickers, extortion, and a failure by European leaders to ensure that their fundamental rights are being respected. I'm almost done. Over the last week, our colleagues in Caritas Austria, just again, the situation for people who are on the move hasn't stopped or halted, because it isn't in the top 10 stories in the media. And it's quite shocking, actually, how quickly it drops from being in the top stories. 4,000 to 8,000 people are crossing the border into Austria on a daily basis. 62% male, 63% are from Syria. And there's no sign that the numbers are diminishing with the approach of winter. And I think that's important. That emphasizes the desperation that exists for people, is that this idea, this comfortable idea that we have had, that it'll stop because it'll be too cold. The cold no longer comes into it. It's life or death. It's survival for people. And so Europe, there's been a lot of talking, and my job has changed radically in the past couple of months, and a lot of my work is monitoring on a daily basis what's happening in terms of European foreign policy. And what is quite interesting is on the 10th of November, Donald Tusk emphasised the need to respect the individual, rule of law, security of its inhabitants will all depend to a great extent on Germans on Germans' action. Then there was the Valletta summit last week, which the emphasis was on tackling root causes of displacement, protecting those who flee their homes, as well as establish a pilot migrants and refugees reception centre. So addressing root causes is around employment and governance and political will. And it didn't come out strongly enough in the Valletta summit, and civil society actors were very disappointed by the outcomes. The emphasis was on preventing the movement of people and facilitating a way that people who do come to Europe and have a failed asylum claim can be returned. And they're very worrying underlying messages that are becoming more prevalent and therefore more acceptable in Europe's foreign policies. And then lastly, I think what from post-Paris, what we can see is some of these kind of quotations, and I think it's important that we emphasize continuously that Paris doesn't change everything. Human rights abuses are human rights abuses. People have the right to seek asylum. People have the right to protection and dignity, regardless of what has happened in Paris. And I think that's the message I want to leave you with. So the collective response of Europe, and what I mean by this is, again, for humanitarian actors, many of us will receive funding, development funding and humanitarian funding from the European Union. And overseas, the influence of the European Union as a guardian of human rights is important, as an influencer in the domestic policies of governments who are not looking after the rights of their own people. And when you look at what Europe is doing within its own borders right now, it will damage itself in terms of being an advocate on a global scale for equality and human rights. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel.